Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. And we have Black Horse with us today. Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
Very good. Support for the show is gratefully received at Subscribestar, which is in the video description. Um, and I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling my expenses are about to go up based on a conversation I'm about to have today, later today or tomorrow. Um, so your support is gratefully received because I basically do this as a sideline while using my primary income to support my 8 children, etc. Um, so I try to keep the show self-supporting, so it's not like I'm not taking bread out of my children's mouth to run the
Support
show.
my hobby, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. Um, yeah, not trying to get rich, just want to cover expenses. Um, okay, so this is a little bit of a different show, and I don't know if you can do anything, Black Horse, but I am getting a little hearing myself a little when I speak. A little bit of a different show, but it's a theme that people joke about a lot. You know what? And then for absolutely no reason, as we say, and what radicalized you, as I used as the title of the show, and um, so on and so forth. But actually, I think it is really an interesting thing, as we're going to see. Um, One might even say, in a sense, it's not normal what we're seeing. And Black Horse himself is a great example of that, as he's going to explain. This is not like, um, this was not inevitable. How about we put it that way? That Black
Yeah.
Horse would be radicalized.
Well,
Decisions were made. Paths, forks in the road were taken.
well,
Right?
well. To begin with, like all regimes have dissidents, right?
Yeah, sure.
And usually, you can predict who those people are going to be. They're going to be economically dispossessed. They're going to be, of a certain kind of inclination or of a subordinated ethnic group in a country.
Mm-hmm.
So
A
you can,
minority group. Yeah, yeah.
so like if you went to Russia today, you could predict based on profile very much who the dissidents were going to be,
Right.
and you could like predict them based on where they are on a map. You could predict them based on like psychological profiles. But one of the things that's interesting about the space of the dissident right is that there are a lot of people out here who would not have been dissidents in almost any regime in history.
Mm-hmm.
So if I
They,
look at
do,
my
they don't fit the profile to use police talk, right?
Exactly. So if I look at myself as an example, I grew up in the center of Canadian wealth and power. My family was part of the Canadian elite. We were quite wealthy when I was growing up, and I'm certainly not inclinationally a dissident by any stretch. I'm not edgy for edginess sake. I'm not. I don't have an emotional need to be in charge of things at all. And
Mm-hmm.
so you kind of, I thought it was worth telling some of this story to kind of understand that actually no, your eyes aren't lying to you. The regime is doing things that are minting dissidents in a way that is very unhealthy for the regime.
Right, and so we would want to distinguish. We'll mostly talk about your story, but just stepping back and putting this in context, we want to distinguish between two kinds of dissidents, and you've talked about this. There's the kind that you're kind of going to always have because it's planet Earth and it's a fallen world, and somebody's going to be unhappy no matter how well things are run,
Right.
right? That sort of thing, and things aren't going to be run that well, right? Because again, we're not in utopia; we're in real life.
Well,
Um,
when I was a
so there's always
student,
going to be some unhappy people.
I read the state papers of Ireland for like 50 consecutive years as part of a primary source research that I was doing,
Wow.
and you'll see the same names of the same nobles getting in trouble all the time, and they get in trouble because they like beat up their peasants for more tax money or whatever,
Uh-huh.
and so like there's a profile there.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. So you're always gonna have people that are not happy, and I'm not even trying to say anything against such people. They may have, as you pointed out, they may have good reasons to not be happy,
yeah,
right? Um, but then you have situations where you have more than that sort of regular background noise of unhappy people. You start to get people who probably should be, if not happy, at least able to kind of tool along and ignore, right?
yeah.
And they start to become radicalized. And now you have actually quite a different situation, right?
Yes, and I think we're seeing we're definitely seeing the emergence of this, and I think this reality is a lot of the reason why we're seeing like in Canada we've seen a very marked shift from a sort of soft regime of control that
Mm-hmm.
went on for a very long time to a lot more use of hard state power,
Right.
a lot more censorship, a lot more um, you know there have been more instances in the last 3 years of using hard police power in this country than there have been like in the past 30 years, going back to
Yeah.
the
Right.
70s.
Okay. So I gather that your story could be broken into at least two parts. Let's call the first part uh, the build up, right?
Yes.
So talk about the build up as far back as you want to go here.
Yeah, so from very early in my life, I went through a process that I call the noticing.
Mm-hmm.
Really begins. I went to school at at a publicly funded special program for that was an IQ selected program for the gifted. And from there, I went to university. And when I went to university, one of the things that I really noticed is that first of all, something like 70% of all the scholarship money that was available was white men need not apply,
Wow.
which is a very interesting message to get when you're 16 and applying for schools. And you've been told your whole life that you're tracked for this, this is what we want you to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get there and you've got the scholarship facts. And by the way, all the language on their websites tells you that because other people are being preferentially selected based on race and sex, that means you're being preferentially deselected for elite
Mm-hmm.
programs based on race and sex.
Okay, and when you say that you had a certain expectation built up, I assume you're not just talking about, your parents or whatever. You're saying that you got an institutional message probably, right?
Yeah.
People at school and stuff like that, teachers and saying, "Oh yeah, this is the way to go for you and this is what you should be doing and this is going to
Well,
be great," right?
yeah. I mean, I was applying for universities at 16. I was pulled into an IQ selected gifted program. Every student there was expected to go to an elite program at a university.
Right.
So there was a very much an institutional message there that you know um, every person in this room is going to go to an elite program at a university and probably get postgraduate education.
And to be fair, that expectation was built on a track record of the past,
Yeah, yeah,
probably. That's how it had been for a long time, probably.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, my great grandfather had gone to university as a member of the Canadian elite.
Hmm.
So there was familiar little track record. I was selected into this program. I, performed pretty well at school. Although one of the things that really frustrated me about Canadian public education was the kind of extreme feminization of that system, with
Hmm.
a hugely disproportionate focus on process rather than results. Which is when you focus on process rather than results, what you're saying is you want women and not men.
Yeah, and I just always have to cite credit where it's due. Christina Hoff Sommers, she has a book called The War Against Boys, and she says our current education system treats boys as defective girls.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought that was a very astute insight.
And so going stepping onward from there, as I started to spend more time in the working world, I got into finance at an early age, and
Oh,
I know.
wait. You were gonna say something about that IQ thing, right?
Oh yeah,
That
well,
program.
so while I was in university, the IQ selected gift program that I'd been a part of was first stripped of its IQ entrance criteria and then scrapped altogether on the basis that it was racist. Um, so
And it's not like that happened and you found out about it like this year. I mean, you knew it was happening at the time,
well, because I knew people who were in the program, I knew
right?
teachers who were dependent on it, like
Yeah.
because I gather that being a teacher in that program was quite a premium job
Hmm.
for like a public school teacher. You had to
Right.
get like special qualifications and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So they were all quite annoyed that the program that was supporting their premium pay was, disappearing.
Yeah. So this hit pretty close to home when this happened, even though you yourself got out right before they shut it down.
Yeah, and I had been aware that people had been destroying IQ selection processes for a while. So my mother was hired at a major software company on the basis of an IQ test. And shortly after she was hired on that basis, it was made illegal in Canada to hire on the basis of IQ testing because of disparities in IQ between racial groups. Um,
Right.
so,
And worth mentioning, academic agent has talked about an interesting pattern, and I hope he does one of his spreadsheets on this or something, which is that you'll see one of these so-called civil rights changes happen across a bunch of Western countries. Like sometimes it seems like within 12 months, it can be really tight. Um, in this case, in the United States, there was. Do you remember the name of the case? Duke Power versus
Duke Power
somebody.
versus somebody, but I don't
Yeah, yeah.
remember.
Anyway,
We
there's a Duke Power case in 1971, something like that. We were just looking at it, and the that was a Supreme Court case that eliminated or stopped companies from using IQ tests as part of their entrance requirements. Um, but in Canada, legislation was passed. Surprise, surprise, around the same time
Yes.
as the U.S. Supreme Court case, right? So they spontaneously all move like at the same time on these things. Isn't that funny? Yeah,
Just by magic.
by magic. Yeah.
S- s-
Anyway, go on, go on.
Yeah, so as I was wrapping up my university education, I was working in finance because my my father a had a small business in the financial industry, so I worked with him in order to pay my way through school. Um, and I noticed I became a Christian when I was 17. I had kind of grown
Hmm.
up in a culturally Christian environment, and at a certain point, I became convicted and and went through a process of repentance and faith. Um,
And potentially from the perspective of certain, say, family members, you became a little too Christian, maybe,
oh
right?
yeah, well the first thing that happened to me after I became a Christian is that about 2/3 of my family like disassociated themselves with me for the rest of my life.
Oh, and they've maintained that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow, that's horrible.
Like to the extent not invited to Christmas, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
wow.
and not because like I threw it in their faces or something, because I
Hmm.
made lifestyle choices that marked me out as, you know, in Canada, a big part of the Canadian elite identity is predicated on, hating hating Red America basically. And one of the symbols of Red America is a certain kind of Christianity. And so if you become a certain kind of Christian, you're a social pariah among uh, a certain kind of Canadian.
Right.
And those Canadians comprise most of my family. So,
There's some kind of uh, status detection, low status detection that,
yeah.
that
So
that got triggered. The
it
the red
wasn't,
flag went up.
yeah,
Right.
it wasn't that I was a Christian in their eyes. It's that I was one of
Right.
those people, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And this again, I this was kind of the next piece of noticing because I realized that professionally this was very bad for me.
Hmm.
So I got married when I was quite young. I was 22, and being married at 22 is another one of those symbols that you're one of those people. Uh, you're not, traveling the
Hmm.
world and living with your girlfriend and whatever else.
Got it.
You mark yourself out as a member of a culture that is antithetical to that class, and so you don't get invited to all the cool parties anymore. Let's put it
So,
that
so
way.
I'm sorry. I'm just imagining. I mean, literally, you're giving the news to like friends and family. Hey, I'm engaged, and instead of congratulating you, they're like mad or
They're
something.
like, "Oh, okay,
Wow.
congratulations, I guess."
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, and it's
So
not like you were doing so. This is a little absurd. I mean, I know that people. I'm realistic, right? And
yeah,
even though I have a little bit of traditional, I want to be trad, and I wish that, um, like in the old days, and I see this in the homeschooling community, people were mature and started their marriages at younger ages, partially because I got married older, and I wish I had been more mature, that my wife and I had been more mature, and we could have started earlier. Um, Maybe had more kids, or just maybe had more energy,
yeah,
more youth
yeah.
while we had kids, right? So I just wish it for people because it's just biologically a better plan to start having children when you're a little younger. Having said that, I know the reality we're in, and the reality we're in is that people mature later, if ever.
If ever,
And
yeah.
having said that, 22 doesn't strike me as like super shocking. Getting married at 19 these days, especially in sort of the upper middle class. Whoa, 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 that's a little young. But 22? That
Yeah,
seemed that seemed really young to them?
22, marrying a 20-year-old, not all,
Huh.
most importantly, not all done with school, right?
Ah,
So this is like a
yeah.
big no-no
Yeah,
socially.
right.
So,
You might not finish your school and join the elite. Yeah.
well, I mean, I was done my school, but my wife wasn't, and
Oh,
she
I
might
see.
she might be one of those filthy women who don't like get a professional managerial class job.
Right, and that is an expectation in
Oh,
in in,
you wouldn't want to
in
do
these
that.
circles. Yeah,
You
right.
wouldn't want to do that. Next thing you'll be having children.
Breeding. Somebody in the comments said, "Did they call you a breeder?" Getting
Oh,
married
gee.
young.
And so like between it was very obvious that that set of choices was a choice that was socially unacceptable,
Hmm.
given my background. And the other thing that I noticed around that time, so I did an internship on a professional trading desk, and I did it during the summer of '08. Um,
Mm.
and during the summer of '08, I was one of the last buyers of stock in Fannie Mae. And I told this story when we did the '08 stream, but I'll tell it again. Fannie Mae, 2 or 3 days before it collapsed, had the CEO come out on TV and did like a formal press release about the sufficiency and quality of its capital. And I parsed this release in great detail in order and like did a series of mathematical analysis to kind of attempt to verify it, and said, you know what, they're gonna make it. They're gonna be fine. We don't need to worry about like the panic is unjustified. And then 3 days later was renationalized, and the shareholders got like pennies on the dollar. Um, and that was one of the first times when I really understood the difference between news and facts. Um,
So
so
really, so until that 2008 meltdown and that experience you're describing, you would have had a general kind of trusting the news, the journalism, the mainstream. Well, like
well,
normies as we call them.
well,
You
prior
you,
to
you
that,
would have trusted the mainstream, the MSM, right?
prior to that, I had the view that the mainstream media was kind of culturally biased,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but that the overwhelming majority of the things that they reported were actually facts.
I
So,
got it. Okay,
like
good.
if I look at the war on terror stuff, I knew that there were biases involved in the way that they were presenting the information, but I assumed that the underlying information itself was true,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe there was some stuff that was left out, but for the most part, or they were reporting facts and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
reporting them in a way that favored a narrative that was culturally acceptable to them.
All right.
'08 was really my first encounter with no, a lot of the things they're reporting just bear no relationship to reality at all.
Little wake up call there. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Wow.
that was that. So those were kind of formative moments to me in noticing the character of the regime. And so my response to that was a response of parallelism.
Hmm.
My conclusions were, yeah, Canada is ruled by like American progressives, and I kind of looked at it and said, American progressives are annoying. They're culturally kind of offensive, but Canada's a small country. It's probably going to be ruled by one nation or another. It has been for all of its history. The Americans are not so bad as far as oppressors go. So my conclusion from that was that it would be good if we established uh, communities and parallel institutions to sort of build up the people that are being excluded by the regime, and in that way, we'll be able to live with the Americans until such time as history changes. And so, to that end, I spent a lot of time in Canada. There's quite a broad network of Christian schools, Christian universities. I got
Hmm.
quite involved in uh, the sort of evangelical Christian subculture that is here, because around these people, I could be culturally acceptable, and yeah, you take your. Oh, the other thing I did is I chose to um, build the family business instead of what what I was expected to do, which was leave the family business and get a job at one of the Canadian banks or hedge funds. So be
Okay.
knowing that I was on the outs culturally with the financial elite, I figured the best way to deal with this was to have my own business and, uh, you know, hire people from my own network, and
Hmm.
then I wouldn't have to care that they, I still deliver. If I deliver the best product, they'll buy from me anyway, and
Hmm.
you know what? Life will go on. I'll have mine, and they'll have theirs.
Okay. So, question. So, as you launched into, like the evangelical institutions and sort of that little subculture, um, I mean, obviously, and of course, I grew up in that subculture. Obviously, you knew that it was not the mainstream culture.
Yeah,
It was sort of a dissident is maybe not a minority culture.
yeah. Well, I
Um,
kind of figured that.
but did you perceive it as a tolerated minority culture? Like
Well,
they weren't going after you guys. You could do your own thing and that was okay.
yeah, I kind of assumed they would leave us alone.
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
and that they would kind of exclude us from their spaces, but they obviously had no interest in being part of our spaces. So like,
Yeah. Yeah.
live and let live, basically was
Right.
the attitude. And
Yeah. You do your thing. We'll do ours. Yeah.
yeah, and if I really need to be part of the social circle of like the financial industry, I can hire people to go to those parties for me. Like that's okay.
Now I'm still including this in sort of part one, the build up, but
Yeah.
already you are yeah, maybe I did make the right distinction in saying that at this point, it wouldn't be quite right to call you a regime dissident. It's
No.
more that you've moved into a minority culture, but a parallel tolerated minority, as far as you can tell.
As far as I can
Right.
tell, a parallel
Yeah.
tolerated minority, and everybody else in that minority realizes that they're kind of a tolerated minority at best, and so we're building Christian schools, Christian
Yeah.
colleges, uh, separate social spaces.
Right.
You don't socialize in and out of that network. Like
Hmm.
it's just not done.
Right.
And so, I kind of assumed that that would be the status quo for the rest of my life, and we'd live in
Right.
this subculture, and the progressives would do whatever they were going to do in the broad culture, and life would go on.
Okay. So this takes us from like around 2008 to about 5 years ago, almost 10 years where you're basically in that mode. Is that
Yes.
right? Or is there something else that happens in that
No,
10
in
years
those
that you
ten
should
in those 10
mention?
years, I'm just uh, building building my business.
Yeah.
Laying the foundations for my family. I'm starting to realize over that 10 years, kind of gradually, how many like that actually the subculture I'm part of is not the church in Canada, but it's like a tiny little piece of the church in Canada.
Yeah.
Gradually the rainbow flags are going up outside churches around me,
Right.
and
Right.
I'm,
Right.
I'm starting to realize I'm not a minority like a 35% minority. I'm more like a 5% minority.
Right, right, right.
Um,
Yeah.
but broadly, I still believe that, um, you know, what does the regime care or what we're doing? Like we pay our
Right,
taxes. We're obviously not a threat to power. There's no political like the Christian Heritage Party, which is the party that purported to represent these people, got like 1% of the vote. Like
yeah,
there's no. If I look historically, minority groups that pay their taxes and don't cause offense to the broad culture and just kind of mind their own business, you know, very rarely do people come after them.
right. Quick inside baseball on the Christian front. Black Horse. I'm familiar, fairly familiar with two countries, evangelical Christians in two countries. In the United States, there's a huge network, huge numbers of evangelicals that would not have the rainbow flag outside their church.
Yeah.
Okay, um, to put it one way. Um,
Yeah.
in England, I've had some exposure over the years to sort of evangelical or conservative Christian circles, whatever you want to call it. We have a number of friends in those circles, um, and I've been there myself. I've visited some churches, and it sounds like they're in a post-Christian setting. There are a few embattled people.
Yeah.
um, nothing like the United States. They're a much, much, much smaller minority. So is Canada pretty much in the UK mode, the US mode, in between?
It's closer to the UK mode
Okay.
than the US mode, but it's not, definitely there are a lot more people than there are in the UK. And
Oh, good.
interestingly,
Okay.
um, like one of the characteristics of the UK conservative Christian group is that they're overwhelmingly low status people. Um, so, like, if you go to a conservative Christian church in the UK, you will find very, very few people who make a lot of money.
Hmm.
Almost none of them, and they
Yeah.
own like very little of their own infrastructure. So it's all the worst church, like all the architecturally impoverished churches are all the places where you're likely to find these people.
Or perhaps, as my church did early on, they're just like renting some
Yeah,
building on Sundays or something, right?
yeah, and
Yeah, yeah.
there in Canada, that's less the case.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
the evangelical minority in Canada owns a lot of blue collar businesses in a lot the same way that it does in the US. So they're
Hmm.
not part of the professional class. In fact, for my job, I'm kind of um, I get a raised eyebrow among those people fairly frequently.
Right.
Um, but they own things like construction companies and landscape companies,
Yeah, yeah.
and so they have a
There
certain
is some money there. Yeah, yeah.
there there was enough money to found like large numbers of Christian schools. There was enough money to
Hmm.
create endowments for Christian universities. Like
Hmm.
there's actual resources and actually quite skilled people there. Unlike in the UK where um, there's very little of that.
We probably have the highest status UK Christians as our friends.
Yes, I think
Just a little,
so.
just a little. I don't know. I'm seeing Nathan Hood in the chat. I'm thinking about Lambda.
Yeah, yeah.
They're high status to me.
There
Uh,
you go.
um, okay. So that 10 years is pretty much in that mode of parallelism, tolerated minority. Your love for the regime is not exactly growing, but you're not feeling increasingly alienated through that time. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. So now I think are we ready to go to part two then?
Yeah, now we're making the transition. The transition
Now there's a turn.
begins with an event in 2018. So, as part of that long-term parallel effort, one of the things that we had done was create two Christian universities, Redeemer and Trinity Western University. And in 2018,
So I'm sorry, these are newer institutions then.
yeah, they're quite new. I think their
Okay.
foundation is in the early 90s.
Okay.
Um,
Very new. Okay.
so that's what I say. Like, there was a transition that occurred before my time when the kind of evangelical minority in Canada decided that it was going to do parallelism, and I kind of
Hmm.
landed in at the end of this.
Right.
And uh, near the end of this, so the Trinity Western University, at kind of the culmination of this effort, decided that it was going to have a law school for Christian lawyers.
Hmm.
And so they went, and in order to get a law school, you have to get accredited by the law societies, the various law societies you're going to license lawyers to work in. And the Ontario Law Society said, well, wait a minute. In Trinity Western's code of conduct, you say that homosexuality is wrong, but homosexuality is the law in Canada. We can't hire lawyers from a university that doesn't approve of homosexual marriage. And so they sued Trinity Western. So they refused Trinity Western's lo- application for accreditation for the law school, and there was a lawsuit that ensued. And over the course of four
So I'm sorry.
years,
Who is suing who? I'm
I
getting
think
lost.
Trinity Western took them to court for
Ah,
declining for what they viewed as religious discrimination,
got it. Okay.
right? And so uh, the resolution to this lawsuit was that Trinity Western could not both have a law school and have a code of conduct that that did not actively approve of homosexual marriage.
Oh, really? So it was stronger than just take it out of there and don't mention it or something.
No, you have to be
You have to affirm it. You have
affirm
to
affirm
affirmative.
you have to affirm in context of law that you do not believe that that the state has any like uh, that there's a legitimate legal interest in regulating this activity.
Right.
So when I saw this, I realized no, they're actually going to use force of law to exclude our people from like the law is the fundamental function of the state, right?
Hmm.
And so if you're going to exclude explicitly Christian institutions from accrediting lawyers, what you're saying is that this minority has no place in the fundamental operation of the country.
Right.
And I assumed from that over time, Christians would be Christians with conservative Christians would be excluded in broader and broader ways from the institutional life of the country. So
Yeah. You
short,
saw no reason to see why this law school thing would be a one-off. The logic of it would
yeah.
be applied broadly. Could right?
And so shortly thereafter, the logical next step was taken, where there are a series of government grant programs that churches use to hire some. So our church had a program where we hired like high school students to run summer camps, and there's some government funding to help pay for summer students. So the Trudeau government came along and said, well, if you're going to take government funding to hire like students to run your camps, you have to actively you can't you have to actively endorse same-sex marriage and abortion, and you have to sign a statement in order to apply for funding that says you actively affirm these things.
Right.
And so the program collapsed overnight because it turns out that the only people who use the programs were churches. Um, and so there was like an extended battle over what the language would be, and that went on. But more and more of these things started happening. So there's two examples. You know, I could cite 10 from the period between 2018 and 2020, and then the other shoe
Okay.
fell.
Wait. I wanted to bring something up real quick, which is that I just wrote a piece recently. I'll share it. Um, with about how I think I strongly urge people to get their children out of the clutches of the regime. And one of the things I mentioned in passing is that school vouchers are not an acceptable approach. Why? Hopefully, it's clear to you from what Black Horse just said. The money going to the state and then coming back to us for parents to choose how it will be spent is not the same as just spending your own money. Why?
Well, because
Because
they'll
the
attach they'll attach clauses
stipulations.
to it.
Yes, yes. You can't spend your money at a place that teaches, superstition or something that's politically incorrect or is against civil rights or on, right? Um, so this idea, and some people are still pushing for this under the name of school choice.
Well,
All we need to do is we need to allow parents to shop around with the money that comes from them, goes through the state, and is in a sense put back in their hands as a voucher. Just let parents shop around; it'll be fine, and it'll just the quasi market will let them select for good schools and all that. No, it doesn't work like that.
yeah.
Right?
I mean, I'm of two minds about school choice. School choice is an excellent way to undermine leftist patronage networks, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
at the moment, money that goes to public schooling just drops into these patronage networks for activists. And if you give parents a choice, they'll undermine that to some degree. And so there's some value in that. But it's definitely not the state of play that you want, right?
Right. Well, the problem, I'll stop on this topic, but the problem, as Lou Rockwell foresaw long ago, as well as Marshall Fritz, that I mentioned in the Substack essay I just dropped um, in the live chat, uh, what they foresaw is that we would actually end up in a worse situation in regards to independent educational institutions because parents would take those school vouchers and want to spend them at private Christian schools,
That's
etc.
right. Yeah.
And now the
This
now
is the counter case, right?
he who pays the piper calls the tune, and what had been to some degree independent religious schools and so forth would now be
Yeah, they would have
uh,
reduced independence.
yeah, it would destroy what um, refuges from the regime we have right now in
Yeah.
terms of schools. Anyway, go on. So what happened next?
Yeah,
So Trinity Western, this is 2018 that the decision is made. I assume that it all
that's
started before this, but the decision comes down in 2018.
yeah. The decision
Yeah.
the decision came down in 2018. I think the lawsuit had been going on in different forms for almost 5 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the previous in the 5 years between about 2013 and 2018, as I start to see these things come, I start getting interested in, well, it might be. I start thinking, well, it might be that actually parallelism isn't a sufficient solution, and I better find. And it's very obvious that politics does not work the way that it's advertised to work. You know, I grew up as part of the Canadian elite. I understood to some degree that the electoral politics is a kind of kayfabe. And so I figured I better kind of learn how politics actually works,
Yeah.
because there was some possibility that the other thing that happened during that time is I got interested in investing I got interested in investing in coal mining stocks, and coal mining stocks are, because they're at the center of they were one of the first things hit by the green agenda.
Mm,
Predicting what the regime was going to do was a very valuable kind of tool in trading coal mining stocks. I made quite a bit of
got it.
money out of this because I started reading people like Curtis Yarvin
Mm,
and other dissident authors kind of from that I kind of accessed through there to try to figure out, well, what was actually going on under the covers of politics. Well,
mm-hmm,
if you can understand that, then you can make investment decisions that outcompete your peers, and
mm-hmm.
it was I quite enjoyed that. Um, but I didn't think that I'd ever it was on the back of my mind that I might become involved at some point, but getting involved in dissident politics is extremely risky. I wasn't really interested in doing it if I didn't absolutely have to.
Right.
And so, in the period between sort of 2015 and 2018, we'll call it an educational period.
Mm-hmm.
The period between 2018 and 2020 was a period where I started to tap my in real life network to try to see, given the weaponization of these these policies against the Christian minority, I was curious to see whether A, how hard was the Christian network against this, and B, was there sympathy for the Christian network out from members of the ruling class?
Hmm.
And I found disturbing results on both cases. First, that the Christians, even engaged in the parallelism project, had no idea what was coming,
Hmm.
and the like, and the members of the regime had like less than no sympathy for Christians.
Wow.
The view that I got from the Canadian ruling class was like, you know, I one of the things that I had done because like every 14-year-old boy, I was interested in the world wars, and I had a nanny who was Polish, and from sort of typical Polish Catholic culture, and one of the interesting things about that experience, my nanny was a Holocaust denier, which is apparently incredibly common in Poland.
No,
Um,
really, I didn't know
and so I was interested in this enough to find out that like by far the most Jews who were killed in the Holocaust were killed in like parts of Eastern Europe, where
that.
the
In
general
Poland, yeah.
Poland most of all, but also other parts of Eastern Europe, where the
Yeah.
local population was incredibly unsympathetic.
Hmm.
Um, just like anti-Semitism had been part of the culture for a very long time, and so
Right.
there was no they were kind of handmaidens to the effort to round these people up. Um, and then I looked at the attitudes of the Canadian sort of professional managerial class, and I realized, oh crap, like if this turns,
Mm.
this could get like really ugly really quickly.
Right,
And
because they do not like you anyway,
no,
basically.
they
Yeah.
have they have no use for you at all, and you know, they would be totally fine with it if you just disappeared.
Mm.
Which was it was instructive to learn. And
Right.
then the other shoe dropped. 2020
Right.
happened. The Wuhan plague was loose in the land, and the government ordered every church in the land to close its doors. Um,
Oh, and I'm curious. In Canada, was it a similar thing? And I didn't study this closely in the U.S. at the time,
yeah,
but I gathered that I remember people joking about it. That if you called your church a strip club, then you could stay open or something. That
yeah,
that that the closures were not just closing everything; it was inconsistently applied. And I can't swear to that because I didn't dig into it. But I think you did pay attention to what was happening in
I
Canada.
did
So.
because so in Canada, the there was quite inconsistent policy in different parts of the country, but
Ah.
for very long stretches of time, it was illegal to have a church service at all. Like you were allowed 10 people inside the building, and yet
Mm.
most retail outlets were operating at like 25% capacity. So you could go to
Mm.
Walmart, you could go to the strip club, you could go to whatever um, at 25% capacity, but you couldn't have church.
Okay, so church they came down harder, or I'm sorry, the restrictions were greater on churches than on retail establishments. Say.
Yeah, because churches were designated non-essential, whereas like
Okay, I see.
retail outlets they were essential.
This is where their underlying religious perspective starts to reveal itself.
Yes, and
Yeah.
so as time went on, um, some churches didn't obey this. Basically, every church obeyed the mandate at first in Canada, and then
To be fair, right at first,
yeah,
we all thought we might all die, or
well
that
that's
it
right.
is a
There
really
was
serious plague situation. Yeah.
yeah, and fair enough.
Yeah.
But this went on for like more than 2 years in Canada. And
Right.
so, over the period of time that this is going on, some churches start to open their doors. And um, So from my own perspective, within a month of the government ordering the doors of my church closed, I basically make a hard decision that my life is never going to be the same again. I can't live with these people. I can't.
Mm.
I believe that there's a hard biblical commandment to meet in churches. You know, could you skip church for a week or two? Sure, and still be a good Christian? Sure, whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
But in no circumstance can there be a government that believes they have the right to close the door of a church and a Christian minority that is tolerated. There's
right.
these two things don't live together. I figure I'm going to spend the rest of my life um, in a position where politics is no longer optional to me.
Right. Yeah, and just a real quick note for non-Christians listening. What is the big deal here? Well, uh, the whole core of Christianity is the incarnation, right? God becoming man. Um, so this whole issue of Christianity being embodied comes through in various ways. Most famously, you have the Orthodox and the Catholic, who believe that the body, the bread and the wine, in some sense, become the real blood and body of Christ, and you need to physically eat it, right? You need to physically take it into your body. But even if you don't have that view, the view that Christians should meet in person, in body, and not just like over a Zoom call.
Yeah.
um, it isn't just an arbitrary like Ludditism against technology or something. It's a deep part of what Christianity's all about.
Well, I mean,
And I
there's
remember reading about the early church and how there were Gnostic Christians who had a different attitude towards the body, and they dealt with persecution quite differently because to them the body didn't really matter. And if you had to say something to not be persecuted, whatever, it didn't really count or something. Whereas for the Christians, the real Orthodox Christians, little Orthodox, uh, what you did really did matter. The body really did matter, and they would put their bodies on the line. And famously, Christians would be martyred. Right. So this is not some sort of current. Don't think of this as a faddish current Christian view. This is a 2,000-year rooted thing that Black Horse is talking about. That Christians should meet in person.
yeah, and as you discussed in your talk at the UK Skildings event, Christians met in person, through the Black Death,
Right.
through
Yeah. Through
uh,
worse things, believe it or not. Yeah.
yeah, and were like marked out from the culture by their willingness to take in people sick with diseases with like 70 and 80% mortality rates because they believed that the poor and the sick should be cared for kind of
Right.
um,
Physically.
on a non-negotiable level.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I looked at what was going on, and um, first of all, it became obvious to me almost immediately that either the restrictions were going to either you're going to have like a reversing of of restrictions and like a Nuremberg trial event where everybody involved in this is going to be purged from the government, or Christians and the Canadian government are on like a generational collision course, and this is just going to be life from now until forever.
Somebody's asking you to get on your mic a little bit more.
Uh,
You don't
is that
sound
a
too
little
bad to me
better?
either. Yeah, that's better. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, with that in mind, I start going to a legal church. Um,
Mm.
and going to a legal church is quite an experience in a lot of ways. I won't talk too much about it, but
Right, right.
it's one of the most profound experiences of my life to like regularly go into a church at a time when pastors were imprisoned without bail for extended periods of time without charge,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the church that I was going to had been harassed by the police several times. Um, many churches near me in proximity had like citizens go and attack all the cars in the parking lot. Several churches had their buildings seized by the government.
Wait, I'm sorry. What did you say about the cars in the parking lot?
Yeah, so regular citizens who lived around the church would notice that people were parking in the church parking lot,
Hmm.
and so they would go and like put nails in their tires and like
Oh,
put holes in
wow.
their windows and all this kind of stuff.
By the way, my sense is that this is more a Canadian story right here.
Yeah,
Um,
this is a
I
Canadian
don't
story.
I don't
Within
think the U.S. had this sort of thing, as I
Well,
recall.
when the U.S. had churches closed for like a month, like a couple of months,
Right.
and then the Supreme Court stepped in and said you can't actually order churches to
Ah,
close.
okay. Yeah, I'm
So
forgetting the details. It's been a couple of years now. Yeah, yeah.
so a lot of churches stayed closed, and the government of California held out for a long time and sued
Hmm.
churches, but it was actually fairly early in the pandemic that there was a Supreme Court ruling uh, that said that you couldn't legally close churches.
Hmm. Got it.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and so
Whereas
when
Canada kept it going with full support from the entire regime.
Oh, for a very long time.
Right.
And like when what's his name? John MacArthur opened his church in California. It's true that the California government, went after churches in California, but they had already had jurisprudence out of the Supreme Court to suggest that they would eventually win their legal case, and they did. So, like, none of the things the regime did actually bit the churches that tried to open in the U.S. Whereas, like, the pastors who were arrested in Canada, two of them were released and had were ultimately found innocent um, in their court cases, but the government kept the property that they seized. Like they seized the physical
Uh,
buildings, they didn't return them.
and then
Um,
they haven't
they
returned them.
have
Is what you're
not
saying?
returned them.
Wow.
They haven't like provided compensation for keeping these men in solitary confinement for 30 to 50 days, depending on the case. Um, they haven't apologized for any of that. Um,
So this is part of what you're getting at. I mean, there's the whole trucker thing, right? But this is part of what you're getting at when you talk about the Canadian regime going with harder power. They weren't
yeah,
just trying to be nice and persuade people. They
yeah.
were
In fact, that's
seizing property, putting in jail, putting people in jail, putting people in extended solitary confinement. I don't know if people realize, but that's considered kind of like torture.
yeah. Well, so what they did, they couldn't convict these people of anything, so they sent them to detention centers that are meant for people awaiting bail hearings. But they would write the judges would rule that they're free to go on their own recognizance, but an element of their recognizance has to be that they sign an agreement not to hold or attend a church service.
Right.
And so they'd end up stuck in these remand centers. Well, the remand center is meant for like to actually get remanded without bail in Canada is like it's almost impossible.
Hmm.
They're meant for like serial killers basically. Um, and so you're in this remand center with like either people who can't raise the small amount of money to support their bail
Hmm.
or people who have committed crimes that are just like unbelievably heinous.
Right.
And you're there um, because these systems are these places are designed for that. They're like the most difficult prisons that exist in Canada.
Okay. So this is like, in a way, you're saying this is worse than if they'd been put into maximum security prison or something.
Yeah,
This is
it would
actually a,
be
a terrible place to end up
yeah.
for an
So
extended stay. Yeah.
yeah, like
Wow.
nobody stays in those places for 30 to 50 days. If you're
Right.
usually you have your bail hearing, and if you don't get bail, you go to like a regular prison.
Hmm.
So you know they're pulling out every procedural card in the book to inflict pain
Right.
because they think that inflicting pain is the way that they're going to get compliance.
Hmm. Right.
Um,
And the pastor, and you've got a number of pastors who are being principled about it and
yeah,
just not budging.
and
Right.
pastors that because I'm part of this minority, like I've sat under preaching from some of these guys in the past. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. You're not
um,
just reading about people in the paper. You know some of these people.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's no way to square that with anything but like the other thing that I should have known better, but I couldn't emotionally square it, was watching other people around me, um, who, I would have thought would be reasonably solid, just melt under this pressure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is serious pressure was getting applied. They
yes.
were not messing around. They were seizing property. They were putting people in jail. And then you're saying even private citizens were joining in the party and just doing sort of vigilante action. And people started to really feel the heat. And as we know from church history,
Well, when people,
some are gonna melt away.
yes, and a lot of them melted away, and that was really painful for me. But um, I mean, it established for me unequivocally that I figured that COVID would come and go. However long that took, might be a long time, but it ended up being about 2.5 years before it came and went in Canada. But uh, the attitudes that permitted COVID to be a thing, the way that it was, is just, they weren't going anywhere. And
Right.
interestingly,
Yeah.
like the next summer after this, so as churches started to reopen, the Canadian government incited what I consider to be a pogrom against Christians in the country.
Yeah. Now,
So
I am sorry that I don't have a better handle on this, but this is where there was. Is this the children being buried
yeah,
thing? Okay. Yeah.
so
Explain this real quick, please.
so the Canadian government had a system that they involved some churches in, called a residential school system, where they forcibly took children away from Native American families and they placed them in boarding schools. And uh, these boarding schools were, not the nicest places. I've known some Native Americans who had gone to them. They were certainly not especially pleasant, and they were aimed explicitly at culturally exterminating Native Americans. This went on from the late 19th century all the way up to the 1980s.
Oh wow.
The last one closed in 1992, I think. And so the Canadian government has been in in the 90s. There was this flip where the Canadian government adopted Native Americans as a client group, so they're now the Canadian government acts like the history of the residential schools is something like the history of slavery in Canada. And they
Every
view,
every Western country has to figure out some way to have a parallel to the United States sins that it beats its breast with, right?
that's
Um,
correct.
yeah.
And this particular version is especially convenient because you can kind of deflect the government's responsibility for the residential schools, because you know it was police officers that went and rounded up these children, not
Hmm.
ministers.
Right.
But because churches cooperated in the schools, you can say, well, it's really the Catholic Church's fault that the residential schools were a thing. And so there was kind of an inconclusive finding in ground penetrating radar near a residential school that the Canadian government published as though it were the presence of 200 bodies of children outside the residential school. Since then, it has been determined that it is most likely that there are most likely no bodies there. They're most likely tree roots. But
Oh my goodness. Tree
the
roots.
the Canadian media ran with this as though some kind of um, as though we discovered some kind of like genocide of Native Americans, and that
Right. Right.
specifically,
Mass graves. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, and that specifically the Catholic Church, the Canadian Church more generally, was responsible for this. And there's just these horrible uh, TV spots of media personalities. Every school in the country uh, adopts this ritual called Orange Shirt Day, where they have assemblies and tell all the children about this, and they like tie orange things on the fences so that there's a physical reminder of these people that these people that never existed, but nevertheless these people. Um,
So wait, I'm sorry. This was the 200, supposedly 200 things that ended up, 200 buys that ended up being tree roots, and they had already established like a whole Holocaust remembrance
Y-
structure.
exactly. Within a few weeks, there was like a Holocaust remembrance structure pushed down
Wow.
through every cultural institution in the country.
Wow.
And they went through uh, and there was a campaign of violence and vandalism against historic Christian churches in mostly in small communities in Canada.
Mm.
There ended up being 71 churches that were targeted. Many of them burned to the ground.
Oh, wow.
Some of those 71 are targeted just for like lower end vandalism, but dozens of them were either burned to the ground or had attempted arsons.
So dozens of churches were targets of arson.
That's correct. And
Wow.
our prime minister went on TV and called the violence, quote, understandable,
Oh.
which is why I categorize this as a kind of pogrom. Like you
Mm-hmm.
have
Yeah, right. From the top. Yeah.
from the top endorsement, not a single person to this day has been arrested or prosecuted
Oh,
for any
wow.
of this.
Wow. So I'm sorry, when was this?
2021.
Okay, 2021. So it's in the middle of like church shutdowns. They're also burning them.
Yes. So, um,
Can't imagine how you got radicalized.
yeah. And so,
Oh, as Dave Bergeron in the comments is mentioning that many Native American churches were burned.
yeah, the targets that were chosen are the same targets leftists always choose, which are targets of opportunity. So most of the churches that were targeted were not churches with large active congregations; they were historical churches,
Hmm.
and so um, many of them, some of them were churches on or near native reservations, where you could kind of plausibly say that they were part of the residential school scheme, but also many churches just in like so most of the Native American population in Canada lives in the western part of the country, um, but many of the churches that were targeted just happen to be churches that were near places where modern progressives live.
You mean in the eastern parts of Canada,
Yeah, in the
probably.
eastern parts of Canada,
Okay.
where there's large populations of client groups to kind of commit violence.
But you're saying the Native Americans were in the west and they were burning churches down the east.
Yes.
And where were where were the residential schools? Where had they
Uh,
been?
mostly
All over?
mostly near the reserves.
So in the west.
Yeah, mostly.
Okay, so it just didn't even make sense.
No, it's
Just
just
attacking churches.
well, you had the government points the finger at the church, the leftist mob finds the nearest church for the most part and goes and commits violence.
Wow.
So, and this is like when I make the comparison to in Europe, it's that kind of institutional lack of sympathy that really brought home to me that Canadian Christians were very vulnerable
Yeah. Right.
because you know various ethnic groups in multi-ethnic countries get targeted for violence for various reasons. What's unique about these kinds of situations is that there's institutional support for the violence and a total unwillingness to use the rule of to enforce law against the people who commit it.
Right. From the very top, as
Yeah.
the what Prime Minister made clear.
Yes.
Wow. Oh, someone's saying they disagree. A lot of the churches actually were burned in BC, British Columbia, and the
Uh,
native parts.
yeah, I've got a map of them.
Oh, okay.
There's 73 of them, so there's room for lots.
Yeah.
Canada. Let me see if I can pass it to you so you can where it is. Here we go. Yeah. I can't pull it up on the fly. Sorry about that.
anyway, so we can
Yeah.
we can check where this stuff happened, but we're mostly talking about the effect on you right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
We've actually been doing this show for a while, so we're
Yeah.
not too far in your story from when you're in these things enough that you're joining me on this show and things like that, right?
Well, I mean, the reason I got involved in this show was because this crap was going on. So
Mm-hmm.
I just sent that to you in the chat.
Oh, okay. Thank
There's
you.
a map. So hopefully you can pull that up.
Yeah. Okay. I just wish I could make it bigger. Yes, I can. Awesome. Okay, this is great. Give me just a sec here. I'm going to present the tab, Chrome tab. There we go. Okay, that should look good, right? Yep. Right. Okay, so yeah, there's stuff in the West, mostly in the West, right?
Yeah.
But
If you,
also in
but
the
also if you
East.
look where I am in central Canada, there's plenty of targets there too.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, what's called Central Canada?
Oh, in and around Toronto, in the Great Lakes region.
Central Canada is very to the east.
It's central
Anyway,
Canada because it's the center of population.
yeah, okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is quite a lot in BC, as the commenter said, but then also plenty around you as well. Actually, can I? Some of them are right on top of each other, so it's a little hard to tell.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
So,
So quite a few around
like,
here.
I'm not saying that it's dominant in Eastern Canada, but um, there was there's enough given that there's like zero association between these churches and the residential schools.
Trying to figure out what the code means. There's crosses and there's fires.
So crosses are where churches were vandalized, fires are where there was arson.
Okay, got it.
So
So yeah, oh wow, lots of fire out here. Lots. Oh my goodness. Oh, quite a few churches. Jeez. Okay. Yeah, thank you. This is horrifying. Just like with this euthanasia stuff, I'm like suddenly like, what's going on in Canada?
yeah,
You know?
yeah,
Hello?
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know what zoom level to put it at, but
Yeah. Anyways, we
anyway.
can move on, but
Yeah. Very
this
interesting.
is
I'll leave
this
it up
is
for a minute.
yeah. So this is definitely going on, and while this stuff is going on, I'm trying to kind of feel my way as to how. Because if you're in a situation where the government is going to suborn like pogroms against you, traditional parallelism is no longer a viable political strategy, right?
Right.
Because anything that you build, they'll use force of law and force of violence to exclude, to exclude to exclude and marginalize whatever they need to do. And so I started to look at the problem more broadly and started to look around and see, well, I've read a lot of these publications for a long time. How can I kind of develop a network to move on from here? And so that's when I started to get involved in your show. I started to get involved with the people who eventually would found the Beowulf Foundation in order to establish an international network because, for all I know, things might get worse in Canada again. Like, it might be important to have an international network at some point in the future.
Yep. Yep.
And so we went and I went and started to build as many connections as possible to what I assessed as high dissidents of high intellectual and moral quality.
Right.
And so that's how the Beowulf Foundation came about. That's how my involvement with Lambda Bible Studies came about. That's how my involvement here came about.
Good comment from Dave Bertrand. In the U.S., after the abortion law changed, many churches were burned down for months, and I haven't seen a map of that, but that would be interesting.
Yeah. Well, there was mutual violence after the abortion laws were changed, right? So there was the campaign of the campaign of pro-life activists against abortion clinics is very much overstated in the press, but it was a real thing that
There
happened.
was some. Hmm. Okay.
But you know, there were certainly leftist attacks on churches at that time. It's not something I'm an
Uh,
expert in particularly.
okay, so I think we got through most of the story, right? And in particular, we've highlighted some of the main things that happened that turned you from someone who I would say was born into an expectation that you would be part of Canada's, not ruling elite necessarily, but sort of the elite segment of the population, right?
Yeah.
Um, and you slowly started feeling like maybe you and the regime are not lined up together, right?
Yeah.
Even at a fairly young age, as a teenager, and then over time, you got to the point where you decided, okay, I need to be in some institutions and help build institutions that are um, minority institutions, but a tolerated minority. And now you're at a point where, okay, we're not even a tolerated minority. And I need to start setting up safety nets, start to see if we can form a counter elite and change things in the long term, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, political change has to occur in the long term
Yeah,
in this country. Well, probably in the West more broadly. Otherwise, my children are going to face, a lifetime of this kind of nonsense.
right.
And it's just that's an unacceptable state of affairs to me.
Yeah,
And so, you know, what can be done, I will do.
right,
And so, we we sacrifice our time, our money, and so on um, to try to do what can be done.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've traveled to England. I mean, etc. Right, on my dime.
Yeah, yeah. Nobody.
uh,
We don't have corporate sponsorship.
yeah, yeah. No Thiel bucks.
Yeah,
Not yet.
yeah,
We're ready to receive something, as academic agent often says. Send them my way. I could put together an institution with some monetary backing. I could put together an institution real fast.
yeah,
We already
yeah,
have the people.
yeah.
um, so yeah, let's not spurn any kind offers from billionaires. But but yeah, we're not waiting for that. Clearly, we're interested in building now with what we can with what we've got, and we're not waiting for somebody to parachute in and save us because
Well, the
that
evidence
that's
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 going
probably
to
not going to
happen
happen.
is, you know, um, fairly lacking at the moment. So,
Yeah, that's right. Um, so yeah, just to again, as we finish up, to put it in the framing that we started with, this is a story of one person, but really a story that many people found familiar. In fact, I noticed Jay Burton said uh, your story was really sounding familiar for him. It's
yeah,
reminding him of his process. Um, so Black Horse's story is definitely not unique in terms of maybe in certain details, right? But in terms of finding yourself thinking, I'll be part of sort of the institutions of this country. I'll be sort of part of the whole thing. To, okay, I'll be on sort of the edge of it or a little bit on the outside of it. To, okay, I'm just outright in opposition to this. What does it take to stop this? Right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Like, what
yeah,
what can I do to avoid, one day that'll be my church that they're coming for.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's uh, you know the difference between uh, you know your church and pastor or whatever, and the church that got burned down and the pastor that uh, got put in jail is almost random luck, right? I mean, it could have been hit much closer to home than it did,
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
hit pretty close to home.
yeah. And
Yeah,
so, like, what are the lessons that can be drawn broadly from this? Well,
right.
as Mr. Haywood would say, um, you have a regime that's a lot more fragile than I think people realize,
Yeah.
and it's fragile because there are a lot of people who are being there are a lot of very competent people who are being excluded or
And
marginalized by it.
and radicalized. Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
like every time you see an affirmative action law, every time you see like a mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, every time you see a pride flag raised over a business, though it's kind of offensive, you should also realize that the exclusivity of that statement is a bug in the regime's program. So
Right.
if you looked back a generation, somebody like me, somebody you know, would have been convinced to spend their time and money supporting the regime because of
Yeah.
the way the regime enriched them.
Right.
Now somebody like me is convinced to oppose the regime because of the way that the regime marginalizes and attacks them.
Right. And long lasting regimes become masters of containment. That
Yes.
is, they identify people that are unhappy, and as academic agent points out with the Tories in the UK, suddenly they go completely against their base and,
Well,
and do something that brings the opposition on board, or they compromise with the opposition, right? And,
yeah.
and this
And
is this
maybe
is
those
this is classic
compromises
containment.
maybe
Right?
those compromises aren't meaningful, but those compromises are enough to prevent the regime from leaking high quality people.
Exactly right. And so what you're telling us, what this story tells us is this is a regime that for now, and academic agent predicts they're going to do a shift here, but for now they are alienating people every day in every way. I mean,
Yes.
it's just amazing. I grew up thinking of the regime in a hostile way because, as I mentioned before the show, my story is a bit different than Black Horses. I've been on the outside and a dissident my whole life, but I viewed the regime as hostile, but I viewed them as savvy. I always thought they were quite shrewd,
Yeah.
sneaky. They would sneak up on you with things, shift the narrative very subtly, so that soon you're thinking almost the opposite of what you were like 10 years ago, and you didn't even realize how it happened,
Yeah.
right? Um, Whereas now they strike me as ham handed, clumsy, um, and just pissing people off. It
Yeah.
reminds me of that great Onion headline when the United States was rampaging around the world after 9/11, invading Iraq, and they called it Operation Piss Off the World. I
Yeah.
thought that was brilliant. And that is what the regime makes me think of now. They do not seem smart. They do not seem subtle. They seem absolutely uh, an elephant in the China room, or whatever, a China
Well,
shop. You know?
and one thing that I want to highlight here is that, and I think this is common. My story didn't begin in 2020. 2020 was an escalation, right?
Right.
Um, they've been struggling with containment for a very, very long time. Like, the existence of Trump is evidence that they struggle with containment. The reality of Brexit is evidence that they struggle with containment.
Yes.
The fact that France is a war zone is evidence that they struggle with containment.
Right.
Um, Whereas, like in the period between maybe 1980 and 2000, you saw none of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, left-wing violence was completely diffused. There was no right-wing dissident movement to speak of. You know, there were a couple of loonies out there at the Mises Institute, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Um, that's we live in a different world. Um,
Right.
and I think a lot of people are skeptical of a guy like Haywood when he talks about regime fragility, but I really don't think they should be. And I don't think they should be because you should be, when you're analyzing the likely future of a regime, you should be looking at what are the most competent people in a society doing.
Right.
And from 1980 to maybe 2005, all the most competent people in the society were like becoming investment bankers or something, lawyers,
Hmm.
investment bankers, you know, maybe going to Silicon Valley. Uh, what are all the best people that are being raised now doing?
Right.
Um, you know, it's I can tell you as somebody in the financial industry, they're certainly not like getting jobs at hedge funds. Um, they they're it's a very different world at the moment, and there are a lot of very competent people with grievances.
Right. And the reason why that might, you might say, okay, but this is still a very small number. But what we find is that, and this is where academic agents, the populist delusion comes into play. Um, we find that political change comes from a small organized minority. Um, you don't think of this as democracy and winning elections. Think of this as Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and that was sort of a joke. The Bolsheviks, sorry, Russian Bolshevik. It means a big, right? They were called the big party, but they were actually the smaller party. The
Yeah.
Mensheviks were the bigger party.
Well,
Um,
and if I look at
and so the Lenin and his coterie were really a small minority, but they were very organized. They'd been thinking about this for a long time. They were ready, and they came out on top, right? So it is not a sheer numbers game of you've got to have 51% of the country that is unhappy with the regime. You don't.
I mean, if I look at the history of Canada, um, the most dramatic political change in Canadian, well, one of the two or three most dramatic political changes in the history of Canada was the rise of the Quebec nationalist movement, which was almost entirely incited by like 15 people, um, who back between basically after the conscription riots of 1918, uh, weaponized popular discontent in Quebec to extract concessions to the point where like uh, French Canadians get preferential access to basically all government positions. Um, and in the post-war era, there are basically no non-French. There are very few non-French Canadian prime ministers in the country, um, because of the basically because a tiny elite decided that they were going to um, use any and all political means at their disposal in order to extract concessions from the Canadian government.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, it's interesting.
Yeah, and interestingly, you did not really talk about the trucker stuff particularly, which was very interesting in Canada, and I think it was very interesting in terms of how the regime handled it and so on and so forth. But it seems like that's not exactly a part of your story, probably because if I'm following all the timing right, by the time that happened, you were already well
Yeah,
onto the
yeah,
dissident side. So
that ship had sailed.
yeah, you
By the
didn't need
time,
more radicalization at that point, really.
well, and by the time that had happened, I understood politics well enough to understand both exactly what was happening and exactly what was going to happen to them.
Yeah, right.
Um, so, uh, like for example, there's a homeschool group not far from us that did like a whole video with all their kids in it supporting the truck protests. And my wife and I were just horrified because why would you want your children associated with people who are going to be systemically politically marginalized and like
Mm,
persecuted for the rest of their life?
right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, maybe you want to do that yourself if you believe in it, but like put your kids in a video, you're crazy.
Yeah. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's highlight a couple things here. Uh, a super chat from Sergeant Hodel. I was actually radicalized by how horrible Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi was. Uh, it's what set me on the path of joining with the Chuds. You know,
There
we
you go.
laugh, but you know, Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, they often say he just wanted to play video games, right?
Yeah.
There is some of that,
Well,
which is literally what is the reaction? It's this regime will not leave us alone. We
yes.
cannot go into any corner and just have our little thing. It's going to come for us, and it will not leave any stone unturned. I mean, to me, I think what this kind of thing is. It
Well, the
radicalizes you because you realize, oh, okay, you know, like you were talking about, I can't just live a little quiet parallel life.
Yeah.
They are
Well,
going to interfere with me,
well, the
right?
other thing about it is their propaganda is so like awful that you can't in a previous era, like if you go back and watch like Spartacus, which is a movie from I think it's like late 50s that it was released, it's very clearly like a leftist anti-slavery tale. But it's also a good movie. So if you
Mm-hmm.
don't agree with the politics, you can kind of, roll your eyes a little bit, and it's still a great movie. Um, but that's not like Star Wars Episode 8 is not a great movie.
Right. Um, hey, quick shout out to StreamYard. AA was mentioning this, but I hadn't experienced it myself yet, which is that now the super chats don't scroll away and they're not hard to find. It automatically marks them, and you can mark others too in this separate little space on StreamYard. So good on StreamYard. Anyway, here's a regular chat I wanted to share from Joshua Ham. He said, I went to college at 16 and realized that I would be unable to continue at school since there were no grants or scholarships available. Hence, I joined the Army. So, wow, this is a wake up call for me, hearing from you and from Joshua Blackhorse, because I went to university for the first time in 1987,
Yeah,
and
and the
I'm
world was
guessing,
quite different then.
yeah, I'm guessing for you guys, this is some years later that you're talking about,
Yeah.
and now I don't remember paying attention. Probably there were minority grants or something. I don't know. I don't remember paying attention because I just had no problem. I got whatever I needed in terms of loans and grants and stuff like that
Well,
to get
what
through an
what
expensive
really
school.
what really
You know.
pissed me off is my family name is actually on a fairly significant Canadian grant,
Oh,
and I'm not eligible for it.
but because of your family, or
No,
just
because
someone
I'm a
else
white
controlled?
because I'm a white man.
Wait. But that was your family stipulation that it couldn't go to white men, or
It was a while ago, and it's a complicated history, but yeah, basically,
oh
because
wow,
of the progs that control it. Um, like, wait a second, that doesn't seem right.
that is really interesting. You
So
were not eligible for your own family's bequest or whatever.
yeah, it was
Wow, that's kind
not
of dark.
not it was very dark.
Because you actually looked into that one in particular, I guess.
Well, I was curious. Like, I was a
Yeah,
good student. I might have
right.
got a grant, but not that one.
Wow,
Um,
unbelievable.
and
Well,
I
thanks everyone. A lot of good interaction today. Sharing your own stories. I've tried to sprinkle some in, but please look through the live chat. There's a lot I didn't share that is really interesting, showing that Black Horse's story is not unique. There are other people who, though the details differ, are finding that they are not getting along with this regime. This regime does not like them. It's not going to like them. Right? That seems to be the picture. And we'll see if they're able to pull off containment. There's a big debate going on with academic agent taking one side, which is he's basically saying that power is going to act in power's interests, and it's
yeah.
just not in power's interest to let a counter elite keep forming. Um, and I totally hear him, and he's probably right.
Well, he's
But
certainly
like
right
I
that it's not.
said,
He's 100% correct that it's not in power's interest to do that. The
yes,
question is
right.
whether
That I agree with.
the question really is whether this regime is capable and disciplined enough to act in its own interest in this regard and
Yes,
bring people back in.
right.
And we're gonna see. I publicly have said that as a result of my observations of the American elite, I think that there's a strong faction within the elite that realizes this and will attempt to bring people back in. Um,
Mm-hmm.
my
But
view
they're
is
not
that
guaranteed of success.
well,
That's
they're
the
not
issue, though.
guaranteed of success, and my view is that this will be a long war. So if I look at
Mm-hmm.
the 70s, you covered a lot of the leftist violence in the 70s.
Right.
What you probably didn't talk a lot about is the way that was just kind of stomped out of existence in the late 70s and early 80s. But it
Mhm.
took a long time.
Yeah, right. They'd been blowing
Um,
things up for 10 years by the late
yes.
70s.
And so, like, containing those people took a long time. If you look at the IRA in Ireland, um, they had to give them a state. They had to, like, it was a very, very long process to uh, get these people into a position where, now it's almost impossible to argue that that radical Irish nationalism is a force in Irish politics. Ireland
Right.
is very clearly a corporate vassal state of
Yeah.
the global American empire.
Just took them about 100 years or so, or 200,
Well,
I
I mean,
think.
if you look from containment, really starts in full force in like the 70s. Took them
Mhm.
40 years at least. Um,
Right.
Now,
Here's
I don't think our leftists are as effective as the IRA, but it'll take a while.
here's our old friend Mickey. Hearing about Canada radicalized me. He says,
There you go.
I wouldn't have said that until I heard about this uh, stuff with euthanasia in Canada. And I don't know if I can pull it up fast enough, but
Do we
I
want
will
to
drop it in the
talk
live
about that
chat
on the
if I
show at
can.
all? Um, yeah. So one of the other lovely parts about our Canadian government is that you know, um, they have a program, medical assistance in dying,
You're a
where
little far from the mic now. Can you get on more?
they have a program
There we
that
go.
they call MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, where they offer euthanasia to well, originally it was to terminally ill patients. Now it's to there's a whole series of criteria, but it can now include the poor and the mentally ill. Um, and so, like, they're at this point, as of 2021, which was the latest stat that they released, even before the expansion of the program, they're killing like 10,000 people a year. Um, so, and these are mostly people who are like poor and don't have good family connections, and so they can't get proper nursing care. So they elect to have the state kill them. Um, so that's pretty wild. I don't know. I can't hear you if you're still on.
Sorry.
There you go.
I know I made a post about this recently, and I'm having trouble finding it. You'd think searching. Oh, there, I found it. Okay. I'm going to share my Planet of the Apes post. But if you follow what I quote tweet down through, you'll see some information from Black Horse that I found just stunning. Okay, I've dropped that in. Um, yeah, so Canada seems like it's on a dark path under under the current regime. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But
Well,
the entire West is
I
right.
mean, the way from here to containment, I have a hard time seeing it in Canada. I don't know how that's going to
Right.
happen. So,
Okay, well, let's stop there. Thanks for super chats and great comments. Definitely, if you're watching this later, reading through the live chat will add to the story that Black Horse has been telling, flesh out more of the story that he's been telling. And it's a great story because it's very particular to Black Horse, but it's also kind of our story, the sensible sinner or whatever we are. It's a story that people can tell in different ways. A lot of people can tell in different ways, and as Black Horse pointed out, it's it's picking people up that normally would not be part of any kind of counter regime movement in any kind of regime that wasn't completely nuts. But this is what we got. So
yeah.
anyway, thanks everybody. Really great stream. Thank you, Black Horse, for sharing your story. And we should see you next week. I will be speaking at the event. I think we still have some tickets left, by the way. It's 2 weeks from tomorrow. It starts in Nashville. If you haven't been, let me just drop that in. I want to make sure that we pack it in on this. As we for various good reasons, we lost our some of our headliners, but we had some great folks. Here we go. Yeah, Sorry, I didn't have that ready. Okay, there it is. I just dropped a link to the Nashville convention. If you would like to meet some like-minded folks, not Black Horse, unfortunately, but folks like who have similar stories as what Black Horse has been sharing. And this is our second time getting together in the U.S. It's the fourth event. Two were in the U.K. I was at spoke at one of them. This is the second one in the U.S. We were at Nashville last year as well, or outside of Nashville. And it was a great event, really encouraging. If you're feeling like, you're feeling a lot of what Black Horse just said, you're really connecting to it, but you're feeling a little bit isolated, please come to the event, meet some like-minded folks. You will be encouraged. You will make friends. You will get involved with organizing that we're doing, and it'll be good stuff. So hope to see some friends there. Please say hi to me if you come. And I'd love to meet you in person. My wife will be with me. If you like the Mrs. Red Lib stuff, she will be there as well. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye till next time.